So good evening, friends. My name is Jeremy Rutledge, and I'm the senior pastor at Circular Congregational Church in Charleston, South Carolina. It's my delight to welcome you to our spring lectures in theology and ethics with Professor John Kaag. I initially reached out to John because his latest book kept coming to mind. In Sick Souls, Healthy Minds, he describes the philosophy of William James as an existential life preserver and offers a heartfelt guide through James's attempt to live with courage and heart in the midst of uncertainty. In the past few years, more and more people have sought me out, asking the questions that William James was asking in his day and John Kaag is asking in ours. So we are very fortunate to have John with us for 2 lectures on William James' philosophy and its meaning for this moment. And we are fortunate to have you as partners with us in the conversation. As we begin, I'd like to offer a few brief notes of gratitude for all who have made this event possible. Thank you to our church's technology team and administrative staff, including Catherine Cullinan and Ted Morrow. Thank you to the Circular Church Endowment Board for generously underwriting our lectures so that they may always be free and open to the public. And thanks to each of you for being here. As we say in our church on Sunday mornings, whoever you are and wherever you are on life's journey, you are welcome here. And that is also true tonight. And we're especially glad to welcome friends from many other congregations, faith traditions, and philosophies to this gathering. It's good to be together as we think about what it means to live meaningfully and well. A word on our format this evening. John will present for about 45 minutes. He and I will have some short conversation after that, and then we'll invite questions from the group. You can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen when it comes to that. And we'll go until about 8:15, at which point we'll wrap up. So with that, I'd like to introduce our guest for the evening. John Kaag is professor and chair of philosophy at the University of Massachusetts, Lowell. John is the author of American Philosophy, A Love Story, Hiking with Nietzsche on Becoming Who You Are, and Sick Souls, Healthy Minds, How William James Can Save Your Life. In his review of Sick Souls, Healthy Minds for the Washington Post, James Kloppenberg wrote that William James himself would have liked the book because, quote, Kaag ties James's ideas directly to the challenges and puzzles of his own life and his readers' lives. How do we deal with isolation or rejection? How do we fall in and out of love? How should we raise our children? How do we escape the numbing throb of our daily routines to savor life's possibilities? James's students revered him because he addressed the meaning of life. Although many academics avoid that topic in their classrooms, everyone should take time to think about it, especially now, end quote. Friends, John Kaag does not avoid that topic in his classroom, and he won't avoid it tonight. Like James, he plunges us right into the questions about the meaning of life with curiosity, wit, and a measure of courage. It's hard to think of a more important or a more relevant conversation, and it's hard to think of a better guide. Will you join me in welcoming our friend and teacher for this evening, Professor John Kaag. Welcome, John. We're so glad you're with us.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. And thank you, Catherine, for helping to organize this. And thank you to the congregation for the invitation. That was one of the loveliest introductions I've ever had. So thank you very much. Tonight, what I'd like to do is to talk to you sincerely as I can, about William James, one of my philosophical heroes, and the question that occupied much of his life, which is the question, is life worth living? And I have to warn you that my delivery, I think, is a bit slower, a bit more deliberate, but hopefully a bit more honest and a bit more human than it was um, 10 years ago, primarily because I take this question so very seriously now, and not just because um, we've gone through something very difficult together over the last 2 years, namely the pandemic. But also 2 years ago, when I was 40, I stepped off a treadmill and immediately went into cardiac arrest and had bypass surgery and struggled to recover. And that event, personal, dramatic moment of crisis, has clarified the importance of this question. And so I've given it a lot of thought, as William James did, for different but also for similar reasons, I think, which we'll explore tonight. So, is life worth living? In 1894, William James, who at that point in his career was regarded as the father of American pragmatism in the United States and the father of empirical psychology, walked himself to Holden Chapel, which is a small building in the middle of Harvard's campus. He had been invited there by the Cambridge YMCA, and the Cambridge YMCA had invited James to come to address the question, is life worth living? It was a hot summer afternoon, or sort of moving toward evening. And James was invited to come in and address a question that had lingered in the minds of many students at Harvard for the previous months, because there had been a spate of suicides on campus. And James had been asked to come and address the audience and also address this question, which is at the root of the question of the meaning of life, the meaning of our lives, and also the potential meaninglessness of our lives. And the Cambridge YMCA invited him, and James obliged. And I bet the Cambridge YMCA wanted him to give an affirmative answer to this question, a simple yes. Yes, life is worth living. James, in a certain sense, disappoints. He does not give a simple yes, life is worth living. But over the years, I've come to think that the response that James does give, the response that we're going to explore in the next 40 minutes, is really the best way to answer the question. And over the next 40 minutes, I hope I make some sort of case about why that might be true. So let's go deeper. James was born in 1842. And he witnessed the Civil War. He witnessed the consequences of the Industrial Revolution. He almost witnessed mechanized warfare at its worst in terms of World War I. And all of those events might have gotten James interested in the question, is life worth living, right? But James was born in 1842 into what I usually consider to be the most privileged of backgrounds. James was born into not Boston Brahmin, but New England Brahmin culture. His grandfather, William James of Albany, was the third richest man in New York State, which meant that William of Albany's son, Henry James Sr., was able to basically do anything he liked. And Henry James Sr. decided to become a sort of writer, theologian, philosopher, and then sired or helped sire a family of remarkable children, of which William James was one of them. William James was born into a life of privilege. He was born into a life of genius. Henry James, the novelist, was his brother. Alice James, the savant, but relatively unknown, shouldn't be unknown, but is. And then William. And so, I mean, really high expectations, a great deal of latitude in what they could accomplish and the opportunities that they had. I think about this a little bit when you think about Siddhartha's background, who would later become the Buddha. I mean, James and Siddhartha weren't that different. They had the sort of compound of luxuries and material luxuries as they were growing up. Every opportunity in the world, right? And when I was growing up reading James for the first time in college and graduate school, it didn't really make sense to me that James would ever really give the question, is life worth living, a second thought. Oftentimes in our privileged lives, we don't. We just think, oh, you get up every day, you have your Wheaties, you have your breakfast, and then you move on through your life. And James did that for a time. But during his teenage years, late teenage years, then through his 20s and early 30s, James suffered extreme depression. And I think he began to tarry at that point in his life with the question, is life worth living? And it would later make it impossible for James to give a simple yes to the question, is life worth living? More on that in a second. Looking back on James's 20s and 30s and thinking about his depression and anxiety, about his insecurity about life's meaning, I've often thought about, well, a single reason. And it's typically a theoretical reason, and James offers it up himself as the reason for his depression or anxiety through his 20s and 30s. And many scholars sort of pinpoint it because James points them to it. It's called the dilemma of determinism. And if there was one direction in the James household, it was this. Henry James said to William James, his son, he said to him, be free, right? Exercise your freedom. Seize the possibilities of life. Be free. Now, that might seem like a very nice way of introducing a child to life, and it is. I have 2 kids, and I oftentimes say that to them, be free. But through the course of James's early education, and as he moved into philosophy, there were a number of different, at least theoretical reasons why James couldn't embrace freedom, at least not easily. So the dilemma of determinism for James is this dilemma, the dilemma that every event is determined in a very prescribed way by previous events, and those events prescribed by even previous events, and previous events, so on and so forth, all the way back. So that any event that is occurring now, even the events that are going on for you and I, the decisions that we're making, are not really our own. In fact, what's happening is, well, we're sort of playing out a long sort of mechanistic model or journey that has been given to us by the past, and now we're moving forward into the future, but it's not really our future, right? We're not actually free to make choices. The past is determining us. Now, this is a very old philosophical idea, probably tracing back to a fellow named Democritus. And it has a second hearing in the modern era with a fellow named Thomas Hobbes. And then it has a third and very vibrant hearing during James's life in the 1800s. So in 1858, right when James is becoming a sort of teenager into his 20s, Charles Darwin publishes The Origin of Species. And Darwin makes the case that we human beings, critters like us, are exactly the same as any other natural organism, which to our way of thinking today, many of us at least, we think, oh, that's that might be right, right? But at the same time, Darwin and his friend Thomas Huxley are underscoring the fact that if we are governed by natural laws, just like every other organism, then our actions are governed, our decisions are governed by genetic, by chemical, by deep sort of genealogical, you know, background. And that's a problem, right? That's a problem for James, at least in two senses. First, our lives that we live out, if determinism is true, are not really ours, first of all. The second, more straightforward philosophical reason is that we don't have free will, right? And that we don't have, if we don't have free will, we don't have great things like, well, morality. How can one be responsible if we're not free, right? And we don't have a spiritual life, according to many theologians and philosophers. Big problem. Now, determinism is one of those sort of theoretical thought experiments that can get one into a real depression, right? And James says that it does. I also, over the last 2 years, have expanded the reasons why James might have struggled with the question, is life worth living? In Sick Souls, Healthy Minds, all I say is, well, there's this dilemma of determinism. We're worried about James's freedom and free will. James is worried that he's not a moral agent, that he has no chance of having a spiritual life. But I think that there's something more to this that I didn't address in the book, and I'm going to share it with you now. I think that there are two additional reasons James has a problem with the question, is life worth living? Yeah, and why he tends to the question, tends away from a straightforward yes. Here are the three reasons. I think that through James's teenage years and into his 20s, he deals with anxiety. And you might say, yeah, every teenager deals with anxiety. I get it. But what I mean by this is that James deals with existential anxiety. Existential anxiety isn't just anxiety about something. In other words, like I'm anxious about spiders or tornadoes or high buildings or something. Existential anxiety is the feeling of possibility and the feeling of not knowing which possibility to seize, not knowing which direction to go. And I think that James's early childhood, his adolescence, into his 20s gave James the sense of, what do I do? Where do I go? There's no direction. I have all of these different routes that I could take, and I don't know which one to take. I think that this sense is one that is common for some students today, and honestly, for many professionals who are older than me. And so if you've gotten this sense, oh my gosh, which direction do I go? I simply don't know. There's nobody directing me, and I'm completely responsible for my choices. I know not what to do. This sense is existential anxiety. I think James had more than his share of it through his 20s and 30s. I think it also jeopardized his sense that life is worth living, because you know that this sort of anxiety can cause sort of crippling paralysis. It's paralysis by analysis. Should I go in this direction or that direction or the next? So determinism, anxiety, I think that there are two other issues at play here. And I have to say, I know that the first half of this lecture is a bit of a bummer. Okay, just hold on. We've got to create the crisis to show how brilliant James is, okay, and how he gets us out of it. So just that being said. So back to the four sort of reasons why James struggled with the question: determinism, anxiety, and then I'm going to say what's theologically rendered as the problem of evil. James was brought up in a theologian's household, somebody very acquainted with all sort of religious and spiritual traditions. Henry James Sr. was a Swedenborgian, and James knew a lot about the problem of evil. And many of you probably know the problem of evil very quickly is that bad things happen to good people. And how could God, who is a omnibenevolent, omniscient, and so all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good God, How could he, she, or it allow bad things to happen to individuals who don't deserve them? Right? That's the problem of evil in a nutshell. And James was extremely, extremely interested in this question. It bled into what I regard as the fourth reason why James struggled with the question of life's meaning, which might be defined as his intuition about what philosophers of the 20th century call the absurd. And James was concerned not only that God might have allowed us to suffer, right? That's one thing. That's sort of, but then you could always say that meaning and human meaning could come from another source other than God. Other philosophers have done it. But James was also concerned that the universe was in some way completely indifferent, completely just not caring about our own human purposes. So that there was this divorce between our purposes, which seem rational, which seem so intensely personal, which seem so vivid, and a universe, the sky above, that simply does not care about us. Right? This is the absurd. If you've read Albert Camus, who we're going to talk a little bit about tomorrow, and James, you will know that Camus defines the absurd as this divorce between human purpose and a completely indifferent world, right? And James is very much worried about this. So we have four different vectors of concern for James. We have determinism, which is the standard one, but I also think we have anxiety, we have the problem of evil, and we have the problem of the absurd. And when the Cambridge YMCA in 1894 asked James to come to Holden Chapel and say, hey, life is worth living, I'm going to give you a bunch of reasons, James balks. At least in part, he's hesitant because he knows that this question has prompted what might be called a pat answer for too long, the simple yes, every day of the week, including Sundays, right? All the time. And James goes slowly. So having thought through the question of life's meaning through these four different sort of obstacles, when he's asked to come and speak to the Cambridge YMCA, he gives a different type of response. James is very much aware that there are usually two mutually exclusive answers to this question. Is life worth living? No. And if you say no long enough, ardently enough, you will probably no longer be with us. You will exit life. Many philosophers in the history of Western philosophy have not given this no response, but rather have given a yes response, and then have given a detailed explanation why this affirmation of life's meaning isn't just particular or singular or applies to me and not you, but rather is universal and is true every day of the week. James is aware of these sort of rationalizations of life's universal meaning, right? He's aware of Gottfried Leibniz saying that we live in the best of all possible worlds. Leibniz was a determinist. He thought God set things up and he's perfect, so we live in the best of all possible worlds. If we don't feel it as such, well, that's our shortcoming, not God's, and certainly not the world's. So, well, just grin and bear it. We live in the best of all possible worlds. Life is meaningful. Human life is meaningful, always. St. Augustine and many Christian theologians have a similar take. They say something like, life is a gift given by God, and far be it for me to actually do away with that gift or to desecrate it in any way, shape, or form. Immanuel Kant in the 1780s and 1790s makes the argument that suicide is wrong and a sin because it violates our rational natures. Our rational natures are the ability to set and pursue ends for ourselves. And it seems like a very strange end, to pursue, to end ourselves, right? And Kant says it produces a type of paradox that should put the brakes on our ideas of self-annihilation, right? James, who had struggled with really suicidal depression through his 20s, late 20s, and early 30s, who says that no man is ever educated until he has tarried with the idea of suicide. For James, these universal affirmations of life's worth are not good enough. And so he gives an answer, which I think is really important and really ingenious for a number of different ways, and I want to share it with you now. James said, this is the point. I mean, we've been waiting and waiting. Here's James's answer. He says, to the question, is life worth living? James says, maybe. It depends on the liver. And as a young man in my 20s, I thought, oh my gosh, James, this is such a cop-out. You got to be kidding me. Maybe? What a joke. You couldn't do better than that? Just give a simple yes. I just want a yes. Okay? Just give it to me. But with James, what I think is really remarkable is that he's anticipating the difficulties that one actually has when they're in the depths of depression. I think that James is actually thinking through the possibility that a simple yes isn't going to be good enough for those people who are facing the abyss. I think James is considering, well, how am I going to get through to someone who doesn't want to listen, who doesn't want to affirm life's worth? Maybe I shouldn't say yes. I'm not going to say no. But maybe I should say maybe. It depends on the liver. Over the years, I've thought that this has become, for me, a way to save my own life, which seems overly dramatic, but it's not. It's very accurate. This maybe has saved my life. And I'd like to explain why I think that this is a very good response to the four sort of obstacles that James faces here. So when James says, maybe life is worth living, it depends on the liver. Let's start with the sort of tagline, it depends on the liver. When one says that life's worth depends on the liver, or depends on you and depends on me, at the very least, he or she or they is saying that that it is up to us about life's worth, that we are, at least in part, control, in part, in charge. And I think that this is a very insightful moment for James. Individuals who suffer from anxiety, depression, suicidal ideations oftentimes describe their experiences feeling, quote, out of control. Perhaps their emotions draw them out of control. Perhaps their situation draws them out of control. Perhaps there are structural factors that draw them out of control. James is suggesting that it depends on the liver. It depends on you. It still depends on you. You get to choose. There is this sign at the bottom of Brooklyn Bridge. It says, life is worth living, which has always kind of boggled me, because why would you need a sign there if it was self-evident to people walking up on the bridge? But at any rate, when somebody's on the bridge thinking about taking themselves out of life, James is saying, wait, it is still up to you. It is up to you to make life worth living. It is up to you to take life as you will, right? The as you will is very important. If you remember the sort of obstacle of determinism, the whole issue was the issue of free will. James struggled with it through his 20s and 30s. He's found a solution in Charles Renouvilier's essay on liberty, and articulated that solution in an essay called The Will to Believe. And James basically says, believe that you are free. Act as if you have free will. My first act of freedom will be to affirm that I have free will, James says, in paraphrase. But I think that this is at the core of the it depends on the liver. Is life worth living? Well, it depends on you. You're in charge. Even in moments when you feel like you're not in charge, you're in charge. Okay, at least in part. So that's one way to take the issue of depends, right? It depends on the liver. I think there's another way to think about this issue of depends. It depends on the liver. James was what philosophers might call a particularist or a pluralist, a person who believed that the universe was comprised of individuals, unique, beautiful individuals that are all different, right? Different. There is no one answer for James to the question, is life worth living? It's not a catch-all, well, everybody's going to be this way, and therefore you have to act this way and think this way. James was completely allergic to that way of thinking. James believed that we were all different, and different enough that there might be cases in individuals where suicide was actually warranted. I know that that's a scary thought, but it's, I believe, the thought that James was having. And at the very least, it affirms the feelings of someone who is going through depression and anxiety, affirms them enough to say, I hear you, right? There might be a case where, as Viktor Frankl says in the concentration camps of Auschwitz and Dachau, perhaps there are cases where people simply cannot bear going on. James is aware of this and is willing to deal with that dark reality. That, however, is never for James an endorsement to sort of fluff this up and romanticize it, ever. That's why he says, you are always in charge. Just like Viktor Frankl, I mean, James is saying between stimulus and response, there is a little space. Another way of saying this, between the world and you, there is a little space. And that space is the place where freedom and action can take place. In other words, the world might be going to hell in a handbasket, but at the same time, we still maintain some modicum of ability to respond to that world, to that torture, to that disaster in a free way. And I think that's really what I'd sort of, as we move off the it depends on the liver and back to the maybe issue of the answer, I think that that's what I'd like to leave you with, which is it depends on the liver. It always depends on you, right? He wants to give you back that sense of free will. I think it's a fairly interesting way forward. Now, what I think is really interesting, right, is the very subtle way that James builds into this lecture, Is Life Worth Living, a type of theological and spiritual response to what I think of as the problem of evil and the problem of the absurd. We've already taken on this sort of issue of determinism and anxiety about all of these possibilities and how do we actually execute our will in circumstances. James is saying, it depends on you. Life's worth depends on you. But now let's turn to a sort of underlying message of James's lecture, one that I've missed for a long time, but I think that it deserves to sort of have a hearing. This is one of the first times that I've made it. So here we go. When James says, is life worth living? Maybe. It depends on the liver. I think he's directing his listener and us to a particular metaphysical reality. And when I say metaphysical reality, it's just a fancy way of saying a picture of ultimate reality. Now, what picture of ultimate reality is James pointing us to? Oftentimes, when somebody is up on the edge of a bridge, um, and I don't speak just from secondhand experience, when somebody is in the pits of despair, it feels like the maybes of life have vanished. What do I mean by that? I mean that the possibilities of life have dried up, that there's nowhere to go, that there's nothing left to explore, that everything is lockstep, determined, right? James is saying, think about the maybes of life. Just think about them. I ask my students to do this, and I'm going to ask you to do it as well. Think about the maybes that make your life worth living. That is to say, the experiences that you undergo and participate in that are not determined beforehand and that you have a hand in their making. You don't know the outcome. I oftentimes say to my students, what are the most meaningful moments of life for you? And they say something like falling in love, having a first kiss, um, playing soccer, playing the drums, playing the guitar, painting. Okay. And then we think carefully about these experiences together. And I say, would falling in love be nearly as exciting and meaningful if you knew how it was going to go beforehand? And they say, no, of course not. Like, no, it's fun because you don't know how it's going to go, because you have a hand in it. I say, how about that first kiss? Like, is it meaningful because you know exactly how it's going to feel, or is the surprise something that makes it meaningful? They say yes. How about soccer? Yeah, it wouldn't be meaningful if I knew every goal that was going to be scored. How about painting? And they say yes, it's sort of developed in process, right? There's a sort of possibility that's always being uh, unveiled. The maybe that James is talking about in Is Life Worth Living is this metaphysical maybe, I would suggest. He's saying that the most meaningful moments in life are the ones that we don't know the outcomes of, right? It's a maybe. Just the same way that if you're in the pits of despair and deciding whether or not to exit left, if someone comes to you and says, maybe life is worth living, it depends on the liver, maybe tomorrow will be better, maybe you have a chance to discover something else, maybe you can play that soccer game, maybe you can paint again, maybe you can read, maybe, right? It's the chance to say, hey, experience never forsakes us, even in our darkest moments. And experience, the way that we're put together, right, as human beings, the way we experience the world always has a sort of slice or a flavor, a sniff of a maybe. And obviously, we're going to fall into depression if we forget that. But James says, think about this maybe. This is the stuff that is the most meaningful of life. Pay attention. Pay attention. Wake up. Come to. And I think what's interesting is that James knows, as he speaks to the Cambridge YMCA, he knows that many of the individuals in the crowd are sort of hard-nosed scientific types, the types that want a clear yes or a clear no. Is life worth living? Yes. But James, in this essay, ingeniously, he says it's about a maybe. And he says to those scientific types who want a clear yes or no, he says, think about yourself. What does science operate on? It operates on a grand maybe, on the hypotheses that we have and the hypotheses that we explore over the course of investigations. That maybe is operative even in the most hard-nosed of disciplines. Pay attention. The maybe's there. He says, have a little patience and open your eyes and see the value of a maybe. Now, You're waiting for the sort of metaphysical reality to unfurl itself here. I get it. James, in his later writing, especially in the pluralistic universe, makes the claim that the universe itself is shot through with possibilities, that chance is an operative force, an effectual force in the world. You might think, why does that matter? James is suggesting that we, as hypothesizing, as maybe driven creatures, are well fit to the universe precisely because we are a part of it and because the universe itself operates by way of so many, an infinite number of maybes. William James's friend, Charles Sanders Peirce, says that all things hypothesize. The universe itself operates by hypothesis, which means that we grow through the chances of the world, right? The mutations, the changes that occur. When James says, is life worth living? Maybe. He's saying, pay attention to the maybe because it's well fitted to the universe at large. If we think back on the problem of the absurd or the problem of evil, the main issue is that we don't necessarily feel ourselves in line or meshed with the world. We feel out of joint. In tomorrow's lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit about the sick soul who feels always out of joint with the universe. The maybe in William James's lecture, Is Life Worth Living, is the reminder that we operate and can form meaning only through the maybes that we explore both at our own risk, but also at our own reward. You risk want, or risk not, reward not. So if you think about the way that you grow, the way that you develop, the way that you mature, the way that you make meaning, it is through hypotheses and testing and maybes. Now, thankfully, thank God, and I say that very literally, thank God that we are in some ways fitted to the universe that also reflects those maybes. For those individuals who struggle with the existence of God, James says, at the very least, notice that we are not completely out of tune with the universe that also operates by way of maybes. James had a friend named Ella Lyman Cabot. She famously wrote, chance, that is to say random variation, chance is always my chance opportunity. That there's a relationship between my human opportunities, the way that I grow and form meaning in life, and the universe's willingness to afford us those chances. So I'll stop there and give you, and I'm very much looking forward to chatting with Jeremy and with you about these issues. For next lecture, for tomorrow's talk, what I'd like to do is sort of give you a sense about how James might help us through the pandemic in very concrete ways. So we'll be talking about James's notion of habit formation, belief, spontaneity, and artistic expression. That's for next time. So thank you very much.
Thanks, John. This is where everyone would be clapping and saying thank you, but on the webinar, you don't get that. So I'll represent for all of us. That was really wonderful and really rich. And I have some questions that may also lead us toward tomorrow. So, and I want to be mindful of those in our gathering who also have questions. But I wondered, I was especially drawn to rereading James actually last fall, which was a particularly difficult period for me. And I think one of the things that drew me back to James was not only his worry, and I was filled with worry at the time, but also the way he seemed to resist the easy answer, the easy yes or the easy no, or perhaps even the easy circumstances of his birth. That this he went deeply into the struggle, and I wondered if I was reading him correctly, or if you just had a sense of if he had a word for us um, about struggle, and that the struggle wasn't intrinsically bad, but that there's really something um, formative about it that might be vital for us. That question isn't coming out quite the way I intended, but I was
No,
he
it's
worried
perfect.
and went through much, and I was worrying and going through things, and I was drawn to him and for those reasons.
Yeah, James says um, that we should do two things that are difficult every day, just for practice. And I think that the idea that struggle, and I'm thinking in part about my friend Paul Bloom, who's a psychologist at University of Toronto now. He wrote a book about suffering, and that there's a sweet spot of suffering. There's a way that you can turn suffering into meaning. We're all going to suffer. I mean, that's the lot of being human. And the question is, can you turn that into something that is meaningful or even transcendent? And um, James, operating out of the 19th century, was definitely aware of a number of philosophers, Friedrich Nietzsche, Arthur Schopenhauer, who said that life is suffering and that we needed to persist. And the whole point is to persist. And I think James is, while he thinks that that might be a sort of pessimistic approach to life, if that's all we say, was very much aware that struggle um, is where humans find meaning. At least in part, I'm thinking about his essay, The Moral Equivalent of War, where he says that human beings um, are drawn to war because it draws them together in the course of struggle. James is not James is not advocating war, but he says that we need a moral equivalent, that we struggle against the sort of the pandemic or natural disaster or hunger or injustice together as we would perhaps against some common foe. And I think that that's a very interesting thought in James, and also potentially problematic for any number of reasons. But um, but I think that's an interesting thought and something that I think James is attuned to.
Thanks. Um, and I wondered, you have access to a group of people that not all of us do. So I have noticed in my own work, people who call me or confide in me, call me as their minister, um, express a lot of the anxieties that James did, and his work keeps coming up in our conversations. I don't often get to talk to college students, and I wonder what of James's ideas or essays really may resonate with them, and if they have a read on him that might be different than ours, given where they are in life. Do you um, hear things that resonate with them, or what?
Yeah,
I wonder
yeah,
what's
I
on their
do.
minds.
I
Yeah.
do. So, I mean, first I'll say that I'll just say it. I think it's sort of sad that you don't hear from as many college
Mm.
students. I mean, when I go to the Unitarian Church here, I don't see that many college students either.
Right.
And hopefully they're getting some sort of guidance, um, or some sort of sounding board, if not guidance. So, to answer your question, so when I give students William James, they're attracted to a number of different um, ideas. One is that he has an essay entitled "What Makes Life Significant," where James says that it is the sort of zest of life, the feeling of that. And I think students resonate with that and want that out of life. They want to connect. I mean, this feeling, this desire, it describes something of communion, where you connect with something, and it's sort of like you plug into an electrical outlet. And that's the zest, right? And you can't do it just by yourself. Even if you're writing, if you're painting, if you're interacting, you're with an imagined community or with the universe at large. You are connected. And I think students really gravitate to that idea. I also think that students are drawn to James because, first of all, because he writes so darn well, but also because he is willing to follow them in their own problems. He has a really brilliant essay, which we're going to talk about next lecture, called "On a Certain Blindness in Human Beings," which basically says that we are blind to the feelings of others. And I think that students really get that, and they see that as a real problem in their own lives and take some direction from James. And I don't want to give too much away for next class, or not next lecture.
Thanks, John. Well, and I'll just offer maybe one other question and then open it up to the group. And I sort of tying the first two together. I lament sometimes that I'm not able to spend as much time with college students. And I also think that it's true in much of American institutional religion that it's not a place of many maybes. You know, it's a place of sometimes absolute answers, or in worst case, superficial answers that don't leave a lot of room for exploration. And hopefully what our congregation and some others are trying to do is give that real space for maybes, and that honest space and a place to go deeper. And I wonder if you think James might, what his word might be. That's a big question, but what he might not think of, but what his word might be for institutional religion. And I don't want to go too far with this question, but even in terms of the development of healthy habits, or just what, if we drew a word from him as a religious community, what it might be.
I mean, a tolerance for ambiguity, I think, and a tolerance for generality. So generality means something a little different for folks like James and C.S. Peirce at the end of the 19th century. Generality really just meant vagueness, ambiguity. And in our very polarized society, James always pushed back against fanaticism, against intolerance, against knowing exactly something. James was always deeply suspicious of those individuals who claimed to know things and then somehow came out on top, at least socially and culturally. He was always a foe of what he called bigness, which was his name for imperialism, but also his name for sort of big-headedness. And the reason why we call James, he was called during his own life an adorable genius. I don't care about the genius part so much. I care about the adorableness. And he was he was adorable in a certain way. People adored him because he spoke so candidly, so well, so from the heart. There's this story, and I'm sorry to go on the length. I know that I want to talk to that, but there is this story about him packing his lecture halls, not even with his own students. I mean, people would come to listen to him because he was so human and so humane and humble. And I think that that's really refreshing.
Yeah, it is. And I think if it's all right, I will share some questions from the group, from the Q&A. And thanks, group, for your questions. Caroline asks, well, she says, I so enjoyed your explaining of James's answer, maybe, to the question, how might his manner of thinking broadly compare to the Eastern mind? She says, for example, Buddhist types of thought or yogic philosophies. So
Oh,
it seems awfully compatible. I'd love to hear your
that's
thoughts.
such a rich question to explore. I mean, and in part, we'll talk about yoga a little bit tomorrow, just with the habits of body and mind. But I will address the Buddhism issue. So, um, I think that James, or I know that James was aware of Buddhism through Paul Carus, who wrote a volume on Buddhism that James read very carefully. And um, there are a couple very deep resonances. One is obviously James was very much aware of suffering through his life and through the historical sort of events of his life. So that's the first. The more overt point, other than the first noble truth, is that um, James believed that one could change their mind and change life because being mindful, thinking about consciousness, thinking about the way that one is interpreting reality, was for James one of the touchstones of his philosophy. If you think about the principles of psychology and his discussions of the stream of consciousness, consciousness, habit formation, this is Theravada Buddhism. Or I mean, it's very much the mind, thinking and being mindful and that the mind changes reality, right? I think that idea is in James. I think that critics of James often regard that as a sort of solipsistic or individualized mode of being. And what I find interesting in James is that while he starts in that really concentration on mindfulness and on what is the mind, what is consciousness, how can you expand your own consciousness, what he moves to is a sort of Mahayana tradition, which has a lot more to do with compassion and others and being other centric in his later philosophy. I'm not sure if there's a direct correlation, but the way that compassion plays into his later philosophy, which we'll talk about tomorrow, I think mirrors the historical movement between those two traditions very nicely.
Oh, what a lovely answer. Um, thank you. I think a lot of us in our reading of James have also thought of our experiences with Buddhism or Zen or different varieties of meditation, and but that it helps to think of those different schools of Buddhism and the different tracks his thought ran as his life went on. Okay, so I'm going to get to the next question from Phil. James's comment about picking two difficult things each day is interesting. In my experience, when one is struggling against big historical trends, i.e., the American slide into racism and authoritarianism, I can't get any traction on the idea that my choices matter and can make a difference. Perhaps a focus on what needs doing at the moment keeps the maybes alive, and yet James's intellect always took him to the big historical landscapes. Must have been difficult for his struggle. And I wonder how to get at Phil's sort of the question that's in there about traction on our ideas,
Oh, it's
that
fine.
on the idea that our choices, that they matter. So
No, I can respond. I mean, I can respond to that, I think, perhaps, or I try to. Um, which is not to say I have an answer for that. That's not what I was saying. I'm saying I just can respond. So, and it's Phil that I'm responding to.
Phil, yes.
Phil. Hi, Phil. So, it's a great question. And James struggled with depression, anxiety, extreme introversion. He was the 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 founder of what is known as the Irish goodbye. He'd go to a party and just then vaporize, like he was gone. Nobody, you wouldn't say goodbye to anybody, just left. And I think that these bouts of depression or insecurity had to do with some of the sense that many philosophers, thinkers, reflective people today have about going up against these sort of monolithic, massive problems that we have today. That being said, James is coming out of American transcendentalism. Okay, Ralph Waldo Emerson is his intellectual godfather. And I think that there's the sense for James that we have to do something, just like Thoreau, for example, where you have to do something, even if it is local. So thinking global and acting locally is Thoreau. I mean, and I think in part it's James. I think James never was as attuned to the working individual as Thoreau was. I think he always was a bit distant. But I also think that James was aware of this sort of Thoreauvian idea that you need to you need to adjust what is right around you, maybe not first, but simultaneously to these wider global concerns. So that's one sort of response. One is think about what's just in your immediate neighborhood. That's not to say blinder yourself to everything else, but to work your own little piece of the garden out, and Voltaire, garden out as you can, right? So that's one thought. The other thought is that James was deeply concerned about social and political issues, but he isn't rarely thought of as a social and political thinker because he didn't write enough about the pivotal issues of the day. Many scholars today look back on James and say, you weren't concerned enough about slavery, about racism, about labor. And I think that his deficiencies might be instructive for our day, right? That we need to try to affect change, even if we don't see the benefits, the immediate benefits. Like oftentimes the change that we affect happens and we don't even know it. Now, this isn't James, this is me. This is a corrective to James. You don't even know what change you're affecting when you try. And the idea that we're going to affect change immediately, at least in my own life, has led me to deep disappointment. And also to this feeling that I never can live up to my own expectations. And I am more inclined to operate like just to know where my values, or try to know where my values are, and push in that direction and let the consequences fade away a little bit, which seems to go against James's pragmatic maxim, which we'll talk about tomorrow. That was a long-winded response. I don't know if it was a good one. I'm sorry, Phil.
No,
it's a hard
thanks.
question.
It's really helpful. It is a hard question. And I know it's one that many in the congregation where we are and many others struggle with, because the justice work we're trying to do we're really swimming against the tide. It's tiring. And but I think James would have known that. He was living with as much uncertainty as we are. So this question is from Sharon. Swedenborg, in his book Heaven and Hell, advocates the belief in an afterlife that suggested the survival of a personality of people of both good and quote unquote bad moral character. He was roundly criticized for this idea. Do you think this idea informed James's lecture regarding is life worth living?
Wow. Didn't expect that one. It's a really smart. I mean, it's a very very great question, and it's a hard question. And I would say, now that you say it, the answer is yes. But oftentimes you get questions and you've heard them before, or you've this is not one of those. So no one, to my knowledge, has made that connection. Now that you say it, it seems to make good sense. So um, the it depends. So the answer, maybe it depends on the liver, cuts in two directions, right? And one of the ways that it cuts is it depends on who you are, right? And it depends on the type of personality that you have. And it also depends on the circumstance that you're granted. That, I think, resonates a bit with the Swedenborg quote that you're referring to. The question then is, can you work yourself out? Can you work your own moral destiny out by yourself? To what extent can you do that? And I think that that was an open question, at least for James. Can it by yourself? So and also for Swedenborg, the issue of, can you work your own moral destiny out by yourself? Um, Again, I think that I'm trying to answer the question. I don't know if I'm doing a great job. It was a hard and very good question.
And I'm looking, if you'll forgive me, everyone, I'm looking at the chat because some questions came in there, and I'm trying to create some balance. Let's see. So Phil asks how we might universalize this process of thought, where all of or a majority of people could find hope in deciding to live for the excitement of the possibilities of living, or maybe extending this to create a more sane society. He says maybe the how question is a difficult question that Phil asks, or how might we? I think it's interesting that James is such an American philosopher, but I don't hear any of him in our and much of him in our current political discourse, or in the current moment we're in, that he seems to speak to it so well.
It's interesting. I mean, when you think about previous presidents, they definitely had a sort of Jamesian bent. I'm thinking about Obama, for example, and he was explicit about the Jamesian bent. And I think that we need to be careful about the word pragmatic. Pragmatic doesn't just mean get stuff done at all costs, and it also doesn't mean that the consequences matter more than the ideals that we embody. Like, that's not what pragmatism, at least the Jamesians, in the Jamesian sense, is. I think that James, for our own political moment, and when it comes to hope and when it comes to aspiration, and also a particular methodology that we should take in engaging in political affairs, James says that we should be honest to experience. He was Emersonian enough to hold that. In other words, we need to judge our ideals and our truths, the beliefs that we have, on the experiences that we and our communities engage in. And we need to test, like good lab scientists, we need to test out our beliefs against the experiences not only of ourselves, but of ever wider, what his friend Josiah Royce would call, communities of interpretation. So, and this helps out when you think like, well, truth is what works. Yeah, but works for who? So the issue is, the works for who is the widest possible community of interpretation for James. So we need to test our beliefs against that. That's one thing. The other thing is that we should pursue what James calls amelioration, or the melioristic philosophy at all points. Meliorism just means, how can we make the world just a little bit better? I think a little bit about that quote that is often attributed to Emerson about what is it to have succeeded, to improve one, to laugh often and love much, to improve one's social condition or garden patch. It's not Emerson, by the way, it's somebody else. But this is what James believed, I think, about not only philosophy, but any type of pursuit that you have in life. Can you make the world a little bit better? Which goes back to Phil's earlier question about, like, how can we improve this if things are so much in the pits? The point is, we just have to try, or not have to. We can choose to try. No, we have to try.
Right. Thanks. And I think I'm looking at the time, and I think we have two more questions that I'll ask from the group. And then already I think people are looking forward to tomorrow. I will just clarify a couple of the questions I think may have misunderstood the use of the word liver, meaning as to mean the person who is living, or the person whose life it is, not meaning the organ.
James was actually a real punster. And so I say this in I say this in American Philosophy, a love story about the liver. So it depends on the liver, but in ancient times, the liver was this organ that you would read, and it would tell the future. And so I think James is playing with this issue. It depends on the liver in terms of, you do have the ability to change your life, right? That's the first, easier. But then the second one, it depends on the liver, which is to say, it depends on fate. It depends on the disposition. It depends on everything that doesn't have to do with you. In other words, there may be people who are born into situations that are really wretched that I can hardly imagine. And maybe that then jeopardizes their sense that life is worth living. I think James is aware of both of those. So he's saying, you're in charge, go for it. And then he's also this sort of humble observer where he says, maybe I don't understand the full extent of your suffering. Like maybe it really is horrible. Maybe your lot in life is bad. So I think that James's liver is multi-resonance there.
Yeah. Yes. Thanks. Well, so this is the speedy part. It's like a speed round of questions. So
sure.
Here are the last two. Bill asks, how do you and how do your students respond to the idea of using philosophy as a mode of healing? Example given, to hold struggles that in 2022 are named as mental health struggles as issues for medical science. So Bill in some ways is getting at that intersection between philosophy and psychology, or but how you might use philosophy as a mode of healing, and perhaps in tandem with other modes.
Right. I think that James is one of the really brilliant 19th century thinkers who is just on the cusp of the disciplines of philosophy, psychology, and medicine fracturing. I think James witnessed this. And in the 20th century, it definitely fractures off. But James, I think, holds, what attracts me to it is that James is so good. He teaches anatomy. He is an empirical psychologist. He's a philosopher. He's a theologian or a religious studies scholar. And James actually believes that they should work in tandem. He also believes that philosophy, as the ancients say, is a mode of very smart self-help, and also a very smart mode of healing yourself. And that's how I take it, at least.
Thanks. And here's the last one. It's just super easy. Mary asked if you could say something about his conception of God and religion. You can. I didn't want to leave that question behind. I know it's a little too big to answer.
That's really easy.
That's right, not with really our last 1 minute.
No, it's okay. So for the last 1 minute, James on God. So James was deeply suspicious of institutional religion for himself. I don't think he ever came out, or actually he did come out several times and criticize folks for being institutionally religious. But I think that he left the space for that. When it came to God, um, James was a certain type of believer, which we'll get into tomorrow, and that type of believer has something to do with what I said earlier about the fittedness between ourselves and the universe at large, which is, I have to say, fairly miraculous, and not fairly, incredibly miraculous. And I'll say more about that tomorrow.
And Mary, you didn't ask me, although, but I do think he fits with um, in the ways that he is so honest, in the ways that he struggles, in the ways that he um, has a world that's again shot through with possibilities, but also uncertainty, and um, that sure speaks to where we are, where we find ourselves. Um, but within all of that, it is awfully good to be together. So thank you for joining us tonight. Special thanks to John, for your time with us and for this conversation, which is so rich, and for the books that you've given us that we can carry home and spend more time with. I hope that those who are here will join us again tomorrow night, and or share the news with friends who may also be interested in this conversation. All are welcome, and we'll meet back here on this platform at 7:00 tomorrow night. And we'll look forward to seeing you then. Thanks, everyone, for being with us.
Thanks so much.